The other thing that comes to my mind a lot is like in my own exploration, when I would have, like a very good time where there's like stimulating, like everything is feeling good, it would always feel like coincidental, you know? And then I was like, wait, like this should happen more. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I made this possible. Like to give myself credit that, oh, I had the foresight to be like, oh, this person seems interesting. And then giving that chance of like, taking that risk of like approaching them and talking and sort of building a relationship, and relationship as in relating with like, there's not saying like there's already like a category of it, but just like, being in relation where you're texting or doing things. And then it's like a good, nice experience. And then feeling like, oh, so this is possible, and for me it was like, oh, how sad that it will only happen in coincidences. That because there's so much of this movie spontaneity thing also, like in movies, like, because you're telling stories, like things can feel serendipitous because they just happen, right? But then life, like there's a lot of things we can do for things to repeat. And every time it can be different sort of experience. But then I realized like, oh, if something happens in just like you didn't expect it, then I'm like, oh, it shouldn't be like then, oh, like with this, in a movie they'll say like, with this memory I will like live my whole life. Like I'm not that kind of like romantic person. So like this should happen. We shouldn't be coming from a place of deficit. Because for me, whenever I've made like in retrospect like bad decisions, it's always been because there's been a deficit of pleasure, so that you then become hopeful and maybe make a mistake. And then I've been fortunate to like learn from those mistakes and say like, this was feeling desperate because these were the elements. And then we only think like, oh, it's only coincident or like very rare that you'll have a good time, And then also to your point, like when we look at like the thing to the climax as the time, then it's already like restrictive, right? Imagination. Because otherwise it can just be like a free-flowing thing that you're deriving pleasure from the company of people or being places and feeling inspired. So my thing was like, oh, how sad if we just think that, oh, it's a coincidence and you experience something and you're like, oh, this will never happen again and I'm happy. And I think a lot of the tropes of romantic tropes are just so much coming from a place of deficit. And then it never excited me because I just didn't understand it. Like why does it need to be... it's that way because, in our market economy, that's the situations we're given so that we purchase things or so that we look at, there's a whole thing about, our bodies are being, there's a need for docile bodies. Like you don't want the kind of bodies that would be there if the revolution happened or we realized our pleasure, right? That would be like, we'd start questioning things, right? So like to me, it was like, why is this only happening like, in a coincident manner, and then so you have to pine for it,
Absolutely.
And then what I would do is like I would try to recreate the same thing because that's the limited way in which I was told like I could get pleasure. But then of course, like any given moment, we ourselves are so different. So how can you put that on another person? Or a different person being like, oh, if we are in this situation, the other person will also act. And then you will keep having that one experience, like you're watching the same movie again and again.
Rather than expanding the genre.
Yeah. And I think it's because we are sold this, sort of like this deficit thing that if you are looking for this, like, oh, like, no, like you should be happy with, this much and I think the thing to like for my own understanding is that, oh, don't fall for that, because that's when I've like made mistakes where I was like, oh, that was not even me. It was just the context in which I thought like, oh, I'm not gonna access pleasure again, right? And then I will just like make decisions that don't feel okay. And I think the hierarchy of like other people having to be involved in your pleasure, like I think I still buy into it because of course we want attention and we want that witnessing. But then there are rituals you can do for yourself that can, sometimes be even better than those times that are created from a response of deficit.
This resonates so much. Indeed, one of the kindest things that someone had said to me, and as you might be able to testify, those close to me have sometimes said, "You're so overwhelming praise and in your appreciation of me, it actually doesn't give me space to appreciate you." And my partner and I remember at one point we were at a spa. This is a person we've talked about pleasure, politics, revolution, all of these align with some of these questions. And I remember there was a point we were at a spa and we had a spa day, splashing and laughing and closeness. And at one point she looked at me and she goes, there I was just eating the cookie, having a great time. And she goes, "So Farida, I need to tell you," and this is a paraphrase, but she goes, "I need to tell you what you give me." And I was like, "Gee whiz, oh no." And she's like, "I see the world through a logic of scarcity. I've long seen it like that. I saw my pleasure in that space." And she goes, "You give me a space to see the world and to see pleasure through a logic of abundance."
Yeah.
And I remember when I heard that, I was very touched and moved, and I was like, "Wow, maybe I should stop praising people to let them talk." Maybe everyone's right. Gee whiz. And at the same time, I think that moment I was very moved, and it felt. It also something that I try to do, because you say there's everyday things about like creating spaces. Like for me, like before this podcast and before I saw you today, like I went with a magazine, and I went to, before I did some work, I went to a coffee shop and had a smoothie bowl and a coffee, and I read my magazine, and I had a great time. And I take a lot of pleasure in punctuating my days with these little moments. I'm very extroverted, as you know, but I love like, oh boy, a smoothie bowl, yum, 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 and like, or that cookie that I talked about. But like, for me, it's all to sort of say like, I think if you sort of say like, what does it mean to, again, this is coming from a very privileged position, because in some ways this kind of pleasure can be, as we've talked about with complicity, can be aligned with complicity. But that said, I think like if we come to the sense of like, pleasure is something that isn't that one special day in autumn, right, with Joe Schmo or whatever, like that was it, and that's what it was, and that's what it felt good. Pleasure can exist all around us all the time. It can be in that great conversation you can have on a podcast with yourself. It can be in a space of sexual intimacy, or it can be like in a space where you have a magazine and you're enjoying your smoothie bowl, and you're like, oh, I think I'm going to go to the gym, or I think I'm going to go and say hello to someone, or maybe I'll write a letter, or I'll sketch, I'll doodle. I think if you can think of your, for me at least, I think of every encounter, even the difficult ones, and every moment as my hope is, and that's not always possible with various pressures, but my hope is that shift the logic so that instead of pleasure coming to pleasure from a space of scarcity and desperation, I need it. I need that pleasure. I need that moment. I need that to be like, oh no, this is something that exists as a kind of background melody in your everyday, so where you can be like, I'm going to enjoy this movie bowl or this magazine or this or like, I'm going to reward myself for doing a little bit of writing, I deserve a treat, or whatever, I deserve them. I think if you can start to do that, and I am in a space where luckily, very luckily, my passion is aligned with my vocation. So but I do think if there is this sense of seeing pleasure as something that's in abundance and that's always accessible to us, I think that allows us to move in a very different way with ourselves and with others. I don't know. Does that resonate?
Yeah, I mean, it resonates, and then also reminds me like, oh yeah, it's something I resonate with, but it's so difficult to do. And yeah, it gives me like a moment of pause. Like it's something that is accessible, but it's also like doesn't make me suspicious, but also is like, oh, is that something that's possible? Like I get it, in mental health, like there's so much of talk around that. I think I think for me, yeah, and then saying, okay, you have painful realizations, then you can sort of move it out through art, which is something I love to do. Like I like to look at, oh, what kind of pictures am I taking? I felt depressed. Like I like to go back and look at, oh, what kind of note was I taking, right? Just to figure out, like, oh, this was what I was like feeling, which is which inspires me to be like, oh, this is what was going on at that time, because it's like meeting yourself, 10 years younger, 10 years, younger than that. Like, oh, this was what I was thinking. That gives me a lot of pleasure in itself to discover that, oh, you were, and something I might have forgotten, because sometimes, you get sort of in this deficit sort of mentality and can like remove yourself from being able to embody, where you are, what's going on. So for me, like it has to, what reminds me, I think I write things down, and it's where I can read it to get a reminder of like, oh, this is happening, because I know I'll forget, and then something else will sort of come out. And a lot to do with, being a social worker, because when you study to be a social worker, you are just primed to look at like the most anxious things, like the crisis stuff, and that in itself is not a bad thing. It's just about like, how do we then say, okay, this is what's around, right? So if there's crisis, there's also these other things, right? Like if you worry about something, that shows what you're hopeful about, right? Like if I'm worried about like, oh, will I get pleasure, in the next few months, then it's saying something about, oh, I'm someone who prioritizes that, and that will make me a better listener or make me a better person to be around, like not anxious, not irritable, right? So there are all these very practical things. Just like we need food, we need intimacy, different kind of touches, like depending on the person. So it's like almost like very basic stuff, right? And then the other aspect is of play, because, like it is, a lot of these things where there's like sensuality, sexuality involved, when there's like long form storytelling around BDSM, like that is play, right? Like people are trying to do that. But then when we see it on the screen, it can look very different. And it can it can be even more confusing. So I think for me, like things have to be kind of like laid out. And for some of these things, like I have to go back and have like, tell myself, like have that internal dialogue to be like, oh, this is what's moving you, And I've had to really, like, it is really ridiculous how it gets in the way. Like a lot of the stuff you study in social work and in the Western psychology, like really gets in the way of your pleasure and limits you from seeing other people's pleasure, right? And all of these things help, right? Like all of these modalities can be helpful, but only if like everyone involved understands like the power dynamics and doesn't say like, oh, I know what pleasure is about for you, let me tell you. So I struggle with like those things when it comes to like accessing, how, or as we've said this, like rescuing joy or rescuing like pleasure or like finding inspiration, and sometimes it can really look like, kicking and screaming. Like it doesn't look pretty, because sometimes you don't want to do it because it's like just even thinking about it, because it's a lot, and we are in very structured, boxed, like very scripted. We are born into very scripted, right? Like situations. Like from this age to this age, you do this. From this age to this age, you do this. When all of that crumbles down, then with it, the sort of that safety and security is kind of taken away, right? And so then what kind of space do you get? That place has to feel safe for you to like deconstruct and construct your own way of living. And so that's something that I like very much think about, where it's not so much just my private baggage. It's also about how I was educated, right? Everything that I like take in, it's not compartmentalized. Like it does affect pleasure.
This is going to sound just like a silly question for a pleasure podcast. But I take your point about the way in which, your education, the way that if someone says to you, like, pleasures, we live in abundant tapestry of pleasure,
Yeah.
like what I just said. And it's always there, ready to be picked off the vine. And you're like, well, whoa, okay, sure. And at the same time, if you're educated to, because something that you said there was like, of the many great things was, if you have an education wherein the tapestry of pleasure is not that, and also if you're trying, because I think we are both, and perhaps many of your listeners, are living or contemplating non-normative rhythms and non-normative relations. I remember I was talking to my therapist, and he said, like, the more non-normative you go in terms of desire and in terms of your interpersonal relations, all of a sudden it puts more pressure on you because you've lost the script.
Right.
Like if it's a heteronormative thing, hello wife, I have to go build a house. I don't know what people say, and then wife is like, and I have to make a sandwich. Again, that was very heteronormative and misogynist, but that sort of like domestic vibe, or you're my partner, I'm the partner at the end, like he said, like you're running your own script, and that puts so much more pressure on you to self-check in, to know what's happening, to know, are you addressing your needs? Are you addressing your desires, or are you just being accommodating? Because, he describes certain kinds of nexus of relationships beyond the heteronormative monogamy as being in a kind of flux.
Yeah.
And so, to take very seriously your point, which is like, if we are cognizant of that flux and that baggage, it's all of a sudden to be like, okay, what does pleasure mean here? And at the same time, to the point about the pleasure podcast, should pleasure be our one question? Should it be the driving question? As you can tell, I definitely think it has its place as a foundational question. But I was contemplating, as you were saying, where is, I know we had previously had talk about where is rage, and what do we do with rage, and and I've had a partner who has said, like, I get motivated by anger. And because as someone who is who often at least says that my access to anger comes less as righteous and more like a sort of much more insular childlike petulance, very which is not it's not propelling anything. It doesn't propel dialogue. It doesn't propel change. It's whatever, it's as limited as that noise is. And I just think, to me, I wonder too, from this conversation and from, the general dialogue, it does also make me think about what is the grace someone can give themselves when they say, am I living a pleasure-filled life to my values? And I've had experiences with others, and I think one of the advantages of being... So there are several advantages. Being read as a man in patriarchy, being disabled. One of the advantages there is I don't really... So in some ways I'm center by being a man. In some disabled, it means that I am outside the center. That's at least in my own contemplation of it. And so there's such a security I have, being, in that position. But for me, I don't feel like I ever will belong. And I think that comes from a place of privilege to be like, great, I can just be me. I can. Exactly. And maybe that's what a pariah says to themselves to go to sleep. But it gives me solace. But it's all just sort of say, I try to be as active as possible to, develop and cultivate intimacy and to show the jugular and to kind of not shy away from the pain and not shy away from the anger or what have you. And at the same time, I know that comes from a place where psychically I feel very assured, I'm like the phallic sort of center, man. I feel very center subject. I also feel very othered, and I know that I have a feeling I'll never really be center. And so I have the two advantages in some ways. I have the pariah's freedom and the center's sense of privilege, and agency. I can do it. And that also comes with class disposition as well. Is whenever disabled, in my case, if we're bourgeois, in a classist society, or how does that mitigate the decenterings? So it's all to sort of say, when I say these things about pursuing pleasure, I I give myself a lot of latitude, and I think it comes from a lot of privilege. But it does make me think, as you were talking, what does it mean to be okay with, am I pursuing pleasure? Am I privileging my pleasure? What does it mean okay to be like, I have a former partner who's very political and will often say at the end of the day, and very against the capitalist system. And when they gesture towards their own political hypocrisy, or like their consumerism or what have you, they winningly say, "Oh, I'm just a girl," which is to say, I'm living in a system that wants to kill me, and wants to hurt me, and so. What can we do? And I love that grace that she gives herself, which is very moving to me. And it's all to sort of say, like, when you're thinking, am I living a pleasure-filled life, etc., there was a point in that story or that moment where you said, I look back at the photos I gave myself, and sorry, was I depressed? What did I see when I was depressed? And what I loved about that story was the way in which you were appreciating you for who you were in that moment. And that is a very different discourse than, I think, am I living a pleasure-filled life? It is a sense of appreciation of yourself, making it and feeling,
And I think I always did that, but I think the credit goes to, like, when we started Utar Chadhav, like, we at some point realized this is an archiving project, and what is worth archiving, right? And especially with mental health, because I moved here like this year, 10 years back was when the earthquake happened. And so there was like so much of attention on mental health, like inundated. And I think good things have happened, but then still, what are we thinking? What is going on is still not something that we can read in books, right? And so we were very motivated to say, like, oh, okay, who's to say who gets to, curate an exhibition or have exhibitions or say, call it art. So we're going to just archive about everything. There's nothing small or big. So I think I was already doing that, but with the colleagues, like, I got the encouragement to be like, oh, this is not about being self-centered, it's about sort of looking at, oh, what was going on around there, right? Because then it also kind of, I think, rightly shuts kind of like the door on, like, because we can think, oh, we have original ideas, and it's okay, we don't, but what was I absorbing, right? Like, and who have I become, that is something that is always like fun to sort of investigate. So, like, why did I keep all those notebooks from when I was a teenager, or diary? Like, there was a reason for that, right? And so more intentionally looking at that feels that there's a lot of pleasure and inspiration with, like, messages that I have written to myself being like, oh, this is going to suck. I think you're going to be fine. But these are things that people are telling you about something that happened in your life. And, like, just a note. And then you read it like 15 years after, being like, oh, this was happening, and then this other thing happened. So I think that to me gives me a lot of pleasure. And I think because we feel that only academia can do it, like, if you have to be academic enough to sort of have your voices heard, or who can be witnessed, like, oh, if someone interviews you that is from that setting, then it's like intellectual, right? And I think that was also saying, like, no, that we can all do it. And so this sort of like very long conversations around pleasure is definitely that, because I think when anything starts, it can feel exciting, but then as you go into it, it's like, oh, what am I, like, what are we trying to do? And so there is a lot of, okay, we're trying to be influenced by what people are like around our thinking, and then we're trying to influence from what we've learned. So it's a very like two-way street. It's not one way where we're creating a podcast where, let me tell you these things. Yeah, let me tell you, because these are the things, I have spent time, reading and learning about. And then there could be something else that you might not have a degree on it, but might have spent a lot of time understanding, right? So then that exchange is also very much like the center of feeling pleasure, because it's like, you can call it like special interest or something. What are you excited about? When that sharing happens, it's very pleasureful and inspiring. And it has ways of like creating more pleasure in other aspects of your life, right? Because when you feel good, like there's that thing you said about like when you feel good, you can sort of give your attention to other things as well. And the other thing that I was thinking was, I think definitely when there's no script, slowing things down has been very, very important. Because I feel like from the time we are born, like there's such a race to like getting to a professional like setup, because capitalism, you have to earn money to make a living. And then there's almost like a lull, right? I'm in my early 40s and there's a lull because from what other people tell me that, oh, you don't have kids. So what are you even doing? As if like my time is not accounted for, right? But there's so many things one can be doing, as vocation. And so in that doubt-filled atmosphere where you are like self-doubting, or did I make the right decision for not having a kid, like not choosing to enter, the marriage institution, like all of that, I think slowing down really has been something that it always doesn't feel pleasurable, because there's like fun in being spontaneous or like rushing to something, like getting a rush, right? Like that's a term we use for excitement. But like I think slowing down and it's like a repetitive conversation of like, oh, what happened here? And why did it happen? Because we don't have a script, right, which you were saying. Mm-hmm. I think the slowing down aspect has felt very good, because otherwise, even abundance is very disorienting. There was one time my father took me and my brother, to a bakery, and he said, like, just order anything. And he was trying to teach us something about economics, diminishing returns or something like that. Like the third pastry is going to not taste good, because you're like stuffed up. So anything too much is not going to feel, great. Yeah. Because you're facing abundance and you're like, you don't know what to do with it, right? There is some risk to pleasure. Like there is some risk to like opening up, because it can be met with like, avoidance or just like, ew, that kind of sentiment. So I think even with abundance, it's like, it's such a, and I think that's where we need other people to tell us like, hey, this is happening. Isn't this what you wanted? Because sometimes it's like right in front of you and you might not know, right? Because the conditioning is so deeply heteronormative and patriarchal, and it promotes like yearning, and longing, and then that can lead to like buying things and commodification, and we can just go that route. But I think slowing down for me has been like it's given, just taking pauses to take stock, and maybe then it's like spending time with yourself, or like doing things that, going out in nature, or which is something, the more you do it, it feels good, but time might not allow it. But that has been something that has felt very helpful, because it can feel very disorienting, because everything is, new. And I think that's why we, choosing convention is that there's already script for it, right? So I think we're also trying to be careful in, these are things you can do within conventions, because I don't think anyone marries because it's such a great institution. It's like people are doing in their inner lives, doing things that are making it bearable, right? Because it's just no way it's not, oppressing everyone involved, right? Even the family structure it creates, it's a very sort of like oppositional thing. It's not about bringing people together necessarily. Like that's how I feel. So like what's been missing, trying to figure out like how are we making sense of our lives, that in itself, and then that can go into like the pleasure conversation, but that in itself is so pleasurable and inspiring.
I mean, there's so much there. I think for me, like from your earlier point of like what this podcast is doing by bringing in a multitude of voices beyond the academic or beyond the expert, having like how everyone, no matter what their quote unquote expertise or background, we all are archives of our pleasure. And I think like I think for me, like it makes me think about the value of the podcast, which is in some ways like offering scripts, like offering moments where you're just like, oh, this is these are people, whether they're in normative circumstances or non-normative circumstances, are trying to find their pleasure or thinking about pleasure.
It's so much more hopeful.
Yeah, exactly. Just having, that I said earlier, like, pleasure, I think, is in some ways, after a revolution, it gives us the possibility. I think having a space where you have a whole multitude of voices from different backgrounds, different subjectivities, different intersectionalities, thinking about what pleasure means to them, you start to see as a listener, I mean, even in this conversation between us, where you're like, oh yeah, this is a great way to think about pleasure, and this allows me a perch into myself that I might not, we had talked about earlier that part of like the dating apps were so interesting was you're like, oh, I'm seeing myself, I'm learning about myself in this process. And I remember, like, there is this feeling, as you were talking about, like, even, and like, for me, like, you had said earlier, like, oh, sometimes when you have too much desire, you don't know, like, how much do I express it to the other person? Where does it go from being, this is great, or is it lecherous? Or i.e., does it make the other person uncomfortable? What does that look like? What does it mean to express desire in ways that invite rather than push, and etc. Like, having these, again, when you're out without scripts, like when, right. And I think when you're, in a sense, to your final point, like the importance of checking in, like the self-check-in, like, wait, how does this feel? I was told by my therapist, because I had the tendency to be so accommodating, I think one of the sharper things he said was, Fareed, he doesn't talk like this. He goes, Fareed, with your, because I was like, well, people tend to, even people I desire, have edged towards platonic with me, and what do I do with that? And he goes, well, and he pondered it. He goes, with your intellect and humor, people sense confidence there. I'm like, oh, do they? And he goes, so people might say, oh, let's me join there. And he goes, but for emotion and for your body, you enter into a space of compromise, accommodation, and hedging. And I was like, I do? But when it resonated, I was like, oh, it's true. Like, and I think for me, he's like, so here's what you need to do. I'm not saying you shouldn't be accommodating, because that gives you pleasure. You like to be accommodating. Yeah. Huzzah. But, he said, take a moment to check in with yourself. Like, is this what you want? Is this... I can understand the relationships being functional, but are they filling your needs? Are they helping you thrive? And just take a moment. And I really liked how my therapist was like, he's not saying don't be accommodating, don't be your impulses, but just check. Like, is this where my pleasure is coming from? And I think having a podcast, having an archive of pleasure where you can see how people are wrestling with these things or wrestling with the same points, all of a sudden, for instance, your own description, of like, oh, how do you express desire without being excessive? And what does that look like? And like, all of a sudden, as you're talking, I was like, oh, that's a great thing. I can bring that. Like, oh, I was having a great conversation. And they expressed this point that I thought was really interesting. How did you feel about that? Like, you're giving people oblique perches into talking about themselves and into facing themselves through this kind of archive. Basically, the archive of pleasure, I wonder, is a space where I wonder how you conceive it as a space where you're talking about the importance of checking in on yourself, how this whole apparatus of the podcast allows you and your listeners to check in on themselves by the ways in which you're inviting people to check in with what pleasure means to them.
And on that note, what would you say, like maybe one or two movies that you feel you like to watch or rewatch that gives you a lot of pleasure?
I'll give you two movies. One is about pleasure and one gives me pleasure. I think the movie that I think is about pleasure, which I love, is of a movie by Luca Guadagnino called I Am Love, with Tilda Swinton. And it's about someone who falls in love with a chef. And this is a mother figure, and her whole life is disrupted in a really interesting and queer way. I think you know the film, by this pleasure. And what's interesting is, because she falls in love with a chef, food is very important to me, as you know, and hopefully not in a pretentious way, and just that it's a consistent route to pleasure. And I remember there's this moment where this character eats shrimp, and And that's the moment where she falls in love. And I remember I watched the scene again at some point. I originally watched the movie. I had eaten a terrible sandwich, and so the movie, which is all about great food, felt like an insult to me personally, because everyone was enjoying great food, and I had to remember my terrible mushroom sandwich that I had. But it's all just to say, when I watched the scene again where she's eating this essentially ecstatic prawn, I think she arrives at a kind of climax to it. There's this moment where when she's eating the prawn, the camera breaks her, the lights go down, so she becomes centered on the plate and on the prawn. And as she's eating it, then the sounds go away of the banal chit chat, and it's just her eating, the sound of her, her fork hitting the plate, and the camera focuses on her eyes, her nose, her mouth, her ears, her hand. Essentially, all of the senses are activated, from sight, smell, mouth, taste, hearing, touch. And I remember thinking, like, that is the most perfect embodiment of what pleasure means, where it grounds you and swells you in this, at least pleasure with food, grounds you in the moment in a particular powerful way, and grounds you in yourself in a way that is not a trap. It is a space of exquisite delight. So for me, that's the film, I think, about pleasure, and that scene in particular I keep coming back to. And I think the film that most gives me pleasure is probably aligned with my favorite film, which I saw when I was 3 years old, which was the original Batman with Michael Keaton from 1989. And I should say, just as a note to your listeners, for context, I was growing up in eastern Montana where there was nothing. There was not even any hills. It was flat. It was cold. I was the son of immigrants, disabled, not really feeling part of the place. And the vision of Gotham City, was just something. It just felt like a siren call of like something else, something. And sure, there was Batman, and it was fun, and yay. But even like when I watched that film, and when I've reflected on why do I love Batman, I was watching someone who wore a mask. And like that became like as someone who sometimes wears or wonders if I wear social masks. Like that was something that I found myself so excited by. Like here was a representation of a different world, a world that wasn't this rural emptiness, but was like an urban complexity. And within it, there was a protagonist who was our hero, who was not afraid to be dark, as you know from the movie, but who ultimately wore a mask. But it was unclear what his mask was. Was it the mask he wore as a superhero? Was it the mask he wore as a billionaire playboy? And I think for me, thinking about this pleasure movie, which I can go back on more and more, as I age, I discover root delights in that, and root ways in which I'm thinking, oh wait, this was a way for me to sense what it meant to feel alienated, and at the same time, what was the power in that. And so those would be the two movies that stand out.
Wait, should we go watch that movie next?
Yes!
Okay, let's do that.
Fantastic.
Thank you for listening.